Hey guys, thank you for tuning in again. I'm Matt O'Neill, and today we're going to be talking about Genesis chapters 12 through 50. So, in this particular section of Genesis, when we look at the J author's contribution to this, the J author's predominantly occupied with the ancestry, with the patriarchs of the faith. And with this, we get some questionable stories, like we have 3 instances where Abraham and Jacob refer to their wives as their sisters, which, at least in Abraham's case, is very much true, because his wife is his sister through his father's other wife's reproduction. I lost what I was trying to say. So chapter 12 verses 10 through 20, chapter 20, and chapter 26 verses 6 through 16. But the J author also lets us know that there's some questionable beginnings to these neighboring countries or the neighboring communities. For example, the Ammonites and the Moabites are the result of incest between Lot and his daughters. We see it chapter 19 verses 30 through 38. The Edomites come from Esau, who's rather hapless, especially when it comes to his brother. Chapter 25 verse 30. The Ishmaelites get their morals from a perverse ancestor, because when Ishmael and Isaac are young, before Hagar before Hagar is forced to leave by Sarah, who is Abraham's wife, it says that Ishmael made Isaac laugh. This is chapter 21, verses 8 through 10. And there's a sexual connotation to this. We see parallels in chapter 26, verse 8, where Abimelech sees Isaac making Rebekah laugh. And because he makes her laugh, Abimelech knows that Rebekah is Isaac's wife and not his sister. So you have to figure, how do you figure if a couple is a couple and not a brother and sister? Well, probably pretty likely because they're having intercourse or doing something romantic or sexual. We see this also in chapter 39 verses 14 and 17, Exodus chapter 32 verse 6. So when it comes to Abraham, there's no clear idea of why Abraham is chosen. It's just sort of out of the blue. There's really no backstory given for God's choice. And Jay's narrative also does not follow any sort of inheritance custom. If we look at brothers, it's usually the second born that is favored. So Isaac is chosen over Ishmael, Jacob is chosen over Esau, etc., etc. When we look at the e-source in these sections, we see obviously contrasting stories, like Jacob gets the land near Shechem by purchase and not by violence, like the J source writes. We see the J source's narrative in Genesis 34, and Genesis 33 verses 18 through 19 is where the E source writes his. Bethel is also an important sanctuary of the northern kingdom. We also have the binding and sacrifice of Isaac in chapter 22. So the reason for this story, more than likely, is very much an etiology. It gives us the name of the Mount Moriah, which is a relatively unknown location in Negeb, and it carries on that theme of the fear of God, which is very much characteristic of the E author's storytelling. When it comes to the P source, we get mostly the genealogies from these stories. Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac, the descendants of Isaac's son, and Esau. There's the be fruitful and multiply scenario that we've seen in others, which are characteristic of P. There's also a fulfillment, and we see also the covenant with Abraham, which is circumcision, the purchase of the family burial plot in Hebron. Now, what's important for our purposes today is Genesis chapter 32. We have the story of Penuel. And the reason for this story is basically Jacob wrestles with God. And in this story, it gives us the explanation for a couple of things. One is the naming of the land, because after the wrestling that Jacob does with God, Jacob says, I will name this place Penuel, which means face of God, or face of El. And he does this because he sees God's face and he doesn't die. And this contrasts other sections of the Bible, like Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, and Judges chapter 13, verse 22, where it states that anyone who looks upon the face of God or who sees God will not survive. It also explains the odd dietary law that the Israelites, or the Jewish people, ended up having, which is that you shall not eat the meat of the hip socket of any animals, which is very interesting. It also explains the name of the river Yabok, or Yaakov, which is very close to the name Jacob, but it also means he wrestled. So this story originated in other Near Eastern mythological stories, like the Germanic tale about trolls guarding the river deity or the sea deity in Greek mythology with the river Xanthus. He fought Achilles outside of the wall of Troy. There's Proteus, like the Old Man in the Sea, like Grendel and Beowulf. The adversary cannot be out after dawn, so the adversary in this instance is God, and God wrestles Jacob during the night until the sun comes up. Once the sun does come up, that's when the fight ends. Jacob beats God, by the way. It's an interesting story. We see a similar fight also break out in Exodus chapter 4, where Yahweh fights Moses, and a very sort of similar tale sort of unfolds. The other interesting thing about this story is that God won't reveal his name to Jacob. This is seen in Judges chapter 13, verses 17 through 18, Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. This is because knowing the name of your adversary is alleged to give you control over them. So El asks Jacob for his name, but he asks for it to give a proper blessing. But it also sort of insinuates an instance of knowing who really has control. So the name change in the name change as well brings about a character change, because in this instance, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And Jacob had been a deceiver. He deceived Esau, he deceived his father in order to get his blessing, to get his inheritance. Chapter 33, verse 14, for anyone interested. But then afterwards, he is continually deceived, like when his sons say that Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, when they say that Joseph is killed. So the name change brings about an essence change as well. So the documentary hypothesis really only explains part of some of these stories. Another part of it, too, might be that there are just certain oral traditions which were passed on and included into these stories. So that was just a weird little side note. I should have prefaced that. Now, in these chapters, the last third of the Genesis tale that we're sort of talking about, we see other Near Eastern parallels, like the Kirta Keret tablets from Ugarit. We have sort of partially saved these documents, and by saved, I mean we found them through archaeological excursions, excavations, and the stories also end kind of abruptly. So in this we see instances of children who are dead, the wife, a character where the children are dead, the wife is left, and El appears and gives instructions for the protagonist to travel to a city to obtain a wife. This is very similar to the Abraham story, at least in that regard. He washes up and goes. There's a command and execution similar to Exodus chapters 25 to 31 and 35 to 40. And this character vows to Asherah that he will present a great wealth in gold and silver if he is successful. And he is. His marriage is blessed by the gods. This character, who I failed to mention is Kirta, fails to live up to his end of the bargain, and he's given a life-threatening illness by Asherah. He has childless ancestors. There's a divine promise of offspring, or excuse me, there are childless ancestors, very much like the ancestors of Abraham and Abraham himself, or his wife Sarah. There's a divine promise of offspring, journey for a wife, a stop at the shrine where the vow is made, and the birth of children. Very similar parallels to the Abraham narrative. Now, for the Joseph narrative, chapters 37 through 50 from the E author, dreams are very much a prominent feature. Some feel that chapter 37 verses 2 through 36 and chapter 39 verses 1 to chapter 47 verse 28 are independent compositions, or sort of a novella. It's very much historical fiction. I would argue all of Genesis is historical fiction. It's not a complete account of Joseph's life. There's a fraternal relationship and the life in and his life in Egypt. Very few details actually link up with the Egyptian sources that we have. So there's no parallels between Egyptian sources, or very few at least, between the Egyptian sources and this writing in Genesis. So in the Egyptian writings, there's no mention of a Joseph, son of Jacob, as an official that are found in any of them. One would expect that, given how high a status Joseph had, that he would be mentioned somewhere in these ancient Egyptian writings, but there's none. Like Daniel, Esther, and Mordecai and Tobit, there's a survival in exile in the foreign court. Joseph overcomes the obstacles with divine intervention, and similarities exist, like the rivalry with siblings, dreams, famine, dangers to the hero, and dangers to Egypt, and deception. The coat of many colors at 37:3. He's stripped of his coat at 37:23, stained with the blood. The coat is stained with blood, and Joseph is told that Jacob is dead. The special robe was worn by royalty, so there's sort of this foreshadowing of what's to come for Joseph. And it anticipates his rise to power. This type of coat is also worn by King David's daughter Tamar at 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 18 through 19. Joseph is stripped of it when he's falsely accused of rape at Genesis 39. He's clothed in Egyptian garb when he's in power, and he gives his brothers fine garments as gifts. So Joseph from Canaan to Egypt, he goes back to Canaan. It's the eventual return of Jacob and Israel to the promised land. Judah and Tamar, chapter 38, is a digression. It's not considered part of the original novella and contains themes of deception, clothing the birth of twins, where the young supersedes the old. So again, that instance of the second-born being shown as favorable to the first. I personally feel like that might be some sort of indication that even though the Israelites took over the land of Israel after the Canaanites, they're preferred in the eyes of God, even though Canaanites and Canaan weren't the original inhabitants of that area. But in terms of the matriarchs, they only appear in relation to the male figures. For feminist theologians, they point out that there are several key characters who act independently of the patriarchs and directly dealing with God, especially with their conceptions. Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel are all unable to conceive at some point. Rebecca had some say in the marriage to Isaac. We see at chapter 24, verses 57 through 58, and the revelation from Yahweh at chapter 25, and Hagar at chapter 16 shows an initiation from the female characters. There's also the initiation by Rebecca to get the inheritance for Jacob. Rachel, we see, is also a wrestler. We see at chapter 30. She wrestles with God, very much like how Jacob did, and she prevails over her sister. So even though they are matriarchs, even though women in writing on the page are viewed as being inferior and are given less rights than the men, they are still strong female characters in these stories. So with that, it brings up the idea, speaking of matriarchs and patriarchs, the idea of endogamy, which is marriage within one's ethnic, cultural, religious community, or for identity. It was essential because it kept property, it kept inheritance, it kept livestock, it kept all the essentials for the family in with them. So exogamy was undesirable, but that's not to say it didn't happen. So Abraham sent a servant back to northern Mesopotamia for his son Isaac's wife. So there's an instance when exogamy happened. He urges Jacob to do the same. Esau marries his cousin to please Isaac. Those are examples of endogamy. Exogamy, Abraham and Hagar. Hagar's an Egyptian. In Keturah, who's a foreigner, chapter 25, Abraham had 3 wives, surprise, surprise. Esau took wives amongst the Canaanites and Hittite women and a Hivite. Joseph marries an Asenath, who's an Egyptian. It threatened their religious identity, but it continued to happen. Moses' wife, for example, Zipporah, was the daughter of a priest of Midian, and David's grandmother, Ruth, was a Moabite. So there are still examples of individuals marrying outside of their religious community or whatever community that they were involved in. So Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and family, these are all legends. None of this is corroborated with any historical documents whatsoever. It's incredibly difficult to estimate when these accounts were alleged to have taken place because, again, there's no historical basis for it. The chronology is very unreliable. It does more to reflect, these narratives do more to reflect the times of the writers and the editors than it does for history. And this primarily has to do with the fact that the earliest ancestors of Israel were nomadic. They didn't have a specific place. While there might be reason to think that certain aspects, for example, of the Exodus may be legitimate, the numbers of the Israelites were incredibly smaller than the accounts actually tell us. So, as an example, in Genesis 14, none of the 9 kings are named, or Melchizedek, or identified in non-biblical sources. The writers are vague. They have unnamed characters like the pharaohs with Abraham and Joseph. The scholars typically date the ancestors of ancient Israel from the mid-3rd millennium BCE to the early 1st millennium BCE. And again, Genesis is historical fiction. The tablets from Nuzi and Amar give us examples of marriage and family law, similar to those in Genesis. The Nuzi have an account of adoption, similar to Abraham and Eleazar of Damascus. The Nuzi also had practices more widespread that cannot be used for conclusive dating. So it makes it hard because these other traditions were used in different areas during different times. It's hard to say when and where these ideas came about. They, again, do more to tell about the author's own time than it does about the characters. So there are texts from the Mari from the 18th century BCE, which include names identical to Israel's ancestors in Genesis, like Benjamin, Ishmael, Laban, and Daniel. And the name for Jacob has a different meaning in these instances, but at best we can conclude that the names are ancient. And one last little bit very specifically about the name El. The name El is used synonymously with God. So it's a Semitic word. It's also used for the Canaanite gods. It's seen in the stone stela dating to the 13th century BCE in Ugarit. There's the Kurta epic, the Akkad epic. The gods are referred to as El also. The king, the eternal father, who guarantees progeny, protects the hero, reveals self in dreams. Exodus 34:6, it says, Yahweh is El, the loving and merciful. So it's a paternal creator deity, also called the bull at Genesis 49, verse 24. And P preserves the past when the God of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob is not Yahweh but El. El is eventually replaced by Baal or Baal in certain cultures as the primary deity, specifically of Ugarit in 1500 BCE, and it's possible to date the authorship to at least this late. But any earlier and things start to get muddy. A little bit rambly, a little unorganized today, but that's okay. So hopefully we all learned something, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter at MWONEII. Like my Facebook page, facebook.com/YouSayThatIam. And I look forward to speaking with you again.